In the Dakota Territory, autumn of 1883, Anders Nielsen was engaged in an act of profound and public foolishness. He was not repairing his roof, nor was he expanding his small cabin against the coming winter. He was inside, perched on a crude ladder, methodically nailing garbage to his ceiling. To any man who passed on the rutted track to the settlement, the sight was baffling. The sound was worse. A rhythmic, metallic tapping that echoed across the crisp air, a sound utterly alien to the familiar thud of the axe or the rasp of the saw. He worked with a shipwright's precision, each nail driven home with practiced economy. The material he used was the detritus of frontier life. Hundreds of tin cans, painstakingly collected from the settlement's refuse pile. Each one had been cut, unrolled, and hammered flat on a stump behind his cabin. Now, cleaned and gleaming, they were being affixed to the underside of his roof sheathing, creating a strange, mirrored canopy inside the unfinished structure. Silas Croft, the man who had built half the cabins in the valley, watched from a distance one afternoon, his face a mask of stern disapproval. Croft was a master of the traditional form. His cabins were monuments of thick, hand-hewn logs, with dovetailed corners so tight a knife blade could not find purchase. He built against the cold with mass, with the sheer, honest bulk of timber and earth. What Nielsen was doing was not just wrong. It was an insult to the accumulated wisdom of men who had survived these winters for generations. The children who watched him work gave his project a name. They called it Nielsen's Mirror Box. The name caught on among the adults, spoken with a wry chuckle at the trading post or over a shared pipe in the evenings. It was a joke, a harmless diversion before the serious business of winter began. Everyone knew what would happen. The Swede's family would be freezing by December, and he would learn the hard way that a Dakota winter could not be defeated by shiny refuse. What did this quiet immigrant, this man who knew more about the cold of the North Atlantic than the dry, biting chill of the plains, understand that every seasoned frontiersman had missed? He understood a secret about heat, a secret not of mass, but of light. He knew that the greatest thief of warmth in a cabin was not the cold seeping through the walls, but the heat rising, invisible and relentless, to escape through the roof. And he was building a trap not to hold the cold out, but to hold the heat in. If you want to understand how this forgotten principle of physics allowed one family to live in summer-like comfort while their neighbors froze, subscribe to this channel right now, because the story of this cabin will change how you think about staying warm. The problem was the cold, but that is too simple a statement. It does not capture the nature of the adversary. The cold in the Dakota Territory was not a passive condition. It was an active, predatory force. It arrived in November as a sharp bite in the air, and by January had become a siege. It was a physical presence that sought every crack, every weakness, every moment of inattention. It was a cold that killed livestock in their pens, freezing them solid in the night. It was a cold that turned a bucket of water left by the door or into a block of iron-hard ice by morning. It made the very timber of a cabin groan and crack in the darkness, the sound like a ship's hull breaking apart. For the settlers of the Blackwood Valley, survival was measured in cords of firewood and the integrity of their chinking. The conventional wisdom, championed by men like Silas Croft, was logical and hard-won. It was a philosophy of brute force. If the cold was a battering ram, you built a thicker wall. If the wind found a seam, you packed it tighter with mud and moss. A cabin was a fortress. Its strength was its mass. A fire was its heart. A roaring, consuming beast that had to be fed constantly. But these fortresses were failing. Even in the best-built cabins, like Croft's own, the reality of winter was a constant, draining struggle. A man could stand by the hearth and feel his front roast while his back froze. The heat from the fire was immense, a torrent of thermal energy that blasted into the room. Yet it was a fleeting victory. The warmth rose. It traveled straight up to the heavy plank ceiling and the sod roof, and there it vanished. The wood and earth would absorb it, grow heavy with it, and then, slowly but surely, conduct it into the impossibly cold air outside. The result was a home of extreme temperature gradients. Near the fire, it was sweltering. 10 feet away, it was frigid. Frost would form on the inside of the north-facing wall, a delicate crystalline lattice that was a beautiful and terrifying reminder of the enemy just an inch of wood away. A cup of water left on a table overnight would have a skin of ice on it by dawn. Families slept huddled together, buried under every blanket and pelt they owned, their breath pluming in the air of their own homes. The cost was measured in wood, an immense, staggering amount of wood. The short autumn season was a frantic race to fell, cut, split, and stack enough fuel to survive the 5-month siege. A family's wealth and security could be seen in the size of its woodpile. And every winter, that pile dwindled at a terrifying rate. By February, the fear was not just of the cold, but of the fuel running out. Men would venture into the deep, drifted snows, risking frostbite and exhaustion for the marginal gain of a few more logs. Anders Nielsen had witnessed this struggle during his first winter. He had done as he was told, building a small but solid cabin to the local standard. He had fed his stove until it glowed cherry red, and he had watched with a growing sense of technical unease as all that heat simply disappeared. His wife, Alara, had to keep their 2 small children, Lena and Eric, bundled in wool even when they were mere feet from the fire. The floor was a permanent zone of icy drafts. His background gave him a different lens through which to see the problem. He had spent 15 years in the shipyards of Gothenburg, Sweden. He had built vessels meant to cross the North Atlantic, to endure storms where the sea and the air were one freezing entity. In a ship's cabin, you could not build with thick earthen walls. You had to be clever. You had to manage every calorie of heat your small stove could produce. You had to understand insulation, air gaps, and the subtle ways warmth was lost. He had learned that heat moved in 3 ways: conduction, the flow through a solid material; convection, the movement of warm air; and radiation, the one everyone seemed to forget. Radiation was heat moving as an invisible wave, exactly like light from a lamp. It traveled in a straight line from a hot object to a cooler one. He saw it every day. The intense heat one felt on one's face when opening the stove door was not from hot air. It was pure thermal radiation. And as he sat in his cabin, watching his family shiver, he saw the battlefield with a shipwright's clarity. The stove was radiating heat in all directions. The heat that traveled sideways was absorbed by the log walls and eventually lost. But the vast majority of that energy, along with all the hot air from convection, rose directly to the ceiling. That ceiling was the primary avenue of escape. Croft's philosophy was to make the ceiling thicker, to slow the conduction. Anders saw this as a fool's errand. It was like trying to dam a river with a wall of sand. You could slow it, but the river always won. He had a different idea, an idea born in the tight, efficient confines of a ship's hold. What if you didn't try to block the heat? What if instead you simply refused to let the ceiling absorb it in the first place? What if you turned the ceiling into a mirror? Not a mirror for light, but a mirror for heat. The thought was so simple, so elegant, it felt like a law of nature he had been blind to. This was the genesis of his foolishness. This was the beginning of the mirror box. The work began in late summer, a season of plenty that made his strange obsession seem all the more eccentric. Anders became a scavenger. He made regular trips to the settlement's dump, a place most men avoided. He would return with his wagon laden with discarded tin cans that had once held peaches, beans, or salted fish. He bartered for them at the trading post, trading a well-carved wooden bowl for a sack of empty tins. The storekeeper, a man named Henderson, thought the Swede was touched by a prairie madness. Back at his homestead, the process was laborious. He built a specialized workbench next to his woodpile. First, he used heavy shears to cut the top and bottom off each can, then snipped down the seam. This left him with a small, curved rectangle of tin. The next step required brute force and patience. He placed the curved tin on a massive flat-topped oak stump and began hammering it with a wide-faced mallet. The sound, that incessant tink-tink-tink, became the rhythm of his days. It was a sound of obsession. It annoyed his neighbors and puzzled his wife, though she never questioned him. He hammered until the curve was gone, until the tin was a perfectly flat sheet, albeit a small one. Then he would take a bundle of the flattened pieces to a grinding wheel, carefully smoothing the sharp edges. The final step was polishing. He used sand and ash and a leather rag, scrubbing until the dull metal gleamed with a mirror-like finish. He stockpiled the finished squares like a miser hoarding silver. By early autumn, he had a stack of hundreds of them, each one a testament to hours of repetitive, seemingly pointless labor. It was then that the construction inside the cabin began. He worked from the top down. His cabin, at that point, had its roof sheathing and rafters exposed on the inside. Most men would have simply nailed thick planks directly to the underside of the rafters to create a ceiling. Anders did something different. He began nailing his polished tin sheets directly to the bottom of the roof sheathing, in the spaces between the rafters. He overlapped each piece slightly, creating a continuous, unbroken, metallic surface. This was the sight that greeted Silas Croft when he finally came to investigate the source of the incessant tapping. He stepped into the half-finished cabin and stopped dead, his eyes drawn upward. The ceiling was a bizarre patchwork of shimmering metal, reflecting the daylight from the door in dazzling, disorienting patterns. Anders was on his ladder, carefully fitting another piece into place. Croft, a man who rarely minced words, spoke with the weight of authority. "Nielsen," he began, his voice echoing in the small space. "What in God's name are you doing?" Anders looked down, his face calm. "I am making it warm for the winter, Mr. Croft." Croft let out a short, incredulous laugh, With tin? Son, that metal is going to be your ruin. It will do the opposite of what you think. He stepped forward, pointing a calloused finger upward. Heat rises, yes. It will hit that metal. But that tin will be ice cold from the roof above it. Every bit of moisture in your air, from your breath, from your kettle, will hit that cold surface and condense. You understand condensation, don't you? Anders nodded slowly. I do. Then you must understand, Croft pressed, his tone shifting from mockery to genuine concern, that in the deep cold, you won't just get drips, you'll have icicles forming on your ceiling. A sheet of ice, right above your family's heads, dripping on them day and night. You are building a trap for the cold, not a shield against it. The argument was sound. It was based on established principles. Any man who had seen frost form on a cold axe head brought indoors would have nodded in agreement. Croft's logic was impeccable. He wasn't finished. And what good is a paper-thin sheet of metal against a Dakota winter? There is no substance to it. You need mass. You need thick timber, packed earth. You are wasting your time on this folly. Anders considered the master builder's words. He did not argue. He did not defend his theory. He simply gave a quiet, resolute reply. The heat does not know it is thin, he said. It only sees a mirror. The exchange was repeated, in one form or another, all over the settlement. Croft's expert opinion solidified the community's view. Nielsen's project became a local joke, a cautionary tale in the making. The name Nielsen's Mirror Box was now used openly, a derisive nickname for the strange cabin at the edge of the valley. Anders ignored it all. He finished his tin ceiling, creating a flawless, shimmering surface. Only then did he add the final layer. He nailed thick, tongue and groove planks to the underside of the rafters, completely covering the tin. The finished ceiling looked perfectly normal, indistinguishable from any other in the valley. The secret was now hidden, sandwiched between the roof and the living space. But what was that secret? How was this system supposed to work? The physics were both simple and profound. Anders had created what would one day be called a radiant barrier. He understood that the vast majority of heat transfer from the living space to the roof was not through conduction or convection, but through thermal radiation. The warm stove, the warm floor, the bodies of his family, they all emitted invisible infrared waves which shot upward at the speed of light. In a normal cabin, these waves would strike the wooden ceiling planks. The wood, being a dark, thermally emissive material, would eagerly absorb almost all of this energy. Its surface temperature would rise, and it would then begin conducting that heat upward through the roof and into the sky. It was an energy leak on a massive scale. But in Nielsen's cabin, those same infrared waves would pass through the wooden ceiling planks as if they were almost transparent to that form of energy. They would then strike the hidden layer of polished tin. Polished metal is the opposite of wood or earth. It is a very poor absorber and a very poor emitter of thermal radiation. It is, however, an excellent reflector. Instead of being absorbed, over 90% of the radiant heat that struck the tin barrier was reflected. It bounced right back down, through the wooden planks, and into the living space below. It was as if he had installed a second sun on his ceiling, an invisible source of warmth that radiated heat back onto the occupants. The heat was not blocked, it was redirected. It was recycled. Croft's prediction about condensation was clever, but it missed a critical point. The tin would not get cold because it was not absorbing the radiant heat from below, and because it was not emitting its own heat upward, its temperature would remain very close to the temperature of the air in the cabin. There would be no cold surface upon which moisture could condense. He had built not an ice trap, but a perfect closed loop of radiant energy. The cabin was an engine designed to be phenomenally efficient with its fuel. An engine no one could see and no one but Anders understood. The only question was whether the theory, born in the hold of a ship, would survive the trial of a Dakota winter. The test came in the second week of January 1884. It did not arrive subtly. It descended like a hammer blow from the north, a mass of Arctic air that scoured the plains and drove every living thing to shelter. They would later call it the Great Freeze. It began with a sky of pale, crystalline blue and a stillness that was deeply unsettling. The temperature at dawn on the first day was 10 degrees Fahrenheit, cold but not unusual. By sunset, the mercury in the thermometer outside the trading post read -5. The next morning, it was -15. The drop was relentless, methodical. By the third day, the official reading was -28 degrees, with a wind that drove the effective temperature into a realm of pure, lethal cold. The community retreated into its wooden fortresses, and the battle began. The roaring fires, once a source of comfort, now seemed desperately inadequate. They consumed wood at a terrifying rate. Men who thought they had stacked enough fuel for 2 winters now looked at their dwindling piles with a knot of fear in their stomachs. Inside the cabins, the laws of thermodynamics were demonstrating their cruel indifference. The heat blasted from the stoves, rose to the ceilings, and bled out into the Arctic air. The walls, no matter how thick, became conduits for the cold. A rime of frost crept down from the corners, tracing the lines of the chinking. On the north walls, this frost grew thick and feathery, 1/8 of an inch of ice on the inside of the homes. The suffering was acute and democratic. Henderson, the trader, found the ink in his ledger had frozen into a solid black lump in its well, despite the pot-bellied stove burning just feet away. A trapper named Dubois reported that a side of bacon hanging in his cabin had frozen so hard his knife could not cut it. Families abandoned parts of their homes, sealing off bedrooms and living together in the single, cramped space around the fire. They burned through their firewood, then their fence posts, then old furniture they could sacrifice. Silas Croft was not immune. His cabin, the finest in the valley, a structure he had always considered the pinnacle of frontier engineering, was failing him. He was burning through his massive woodpile at a rate he had never imagined possible. The heat from his huge stone fireplace was immense, but it was a localized phenomenon. 10 feet from the hearth, the cold ruled. His wife and children were huddled in blankets, their faces pinched and pale. He felt a deep, professional shame, followed by a surge of cold fear. He had taught these people how to build. He had assured them that thick walls and a tight roof were the answer. And now his methods were being exposed as flawed, not by a rival builder, but by nature itself. His expertise was useless. His certainty had become his prison. And in the darkest, coldest hours of the night, a new thought began to trouble him, a thought that carried with it a heavy weight of guilt. He thought of the Swede. He thought of Nilsson's mirror box. He imagined the thin, uninsulated roof and the foolish tin ceiling. He pictured the family inside, suffering a fate far worse than his own. The man's pride, he thought, may have killed them. The thought gnawed at him for 2 days. On the 5th day of the freeze, with the wind shrieking and the air so cold it felt like shattered glass in his lungs, he could bear it no longer. It was a matter of conscience. He had to check on them. He expected to find a cabin of ice, a family on the verge of freezing to death, a tragic and avoidable end to a foolish experiment. Pulling on every layer of wool and fur he owned, he stepped out into the storm. The walk to Nilsson's homestead was only 1/4 of a mile, but it was a journey through a hostile, alien world. The wind tore at him, stealing his breath and driving ice crystals into the exposed skin around his eyes. The snow was packed as hard as stone, squeaking under his boots with a dry, alien sound. The world had been stripped of all color, reduced to a brutal monochrome of white snow and gray sky. As he approached the cabin, his sense of dread deepened. He saw the chimney first. There was no plume of thick, dark smoke pouring from it, the sign of a desperate, roaring fire. Instead, there was only a thin, lazy wisp of white vapor, barely visible against the gray sky. The kind of smoke one might see on a mild autumn day. He feared the worst. They had run out of wood. The fire was dying. He reached the door, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and grim certainty. He raised a gloved hand and knocked, the sound unnaturally loud in the howling wind. He expected a long delay, a weak, shivering figure answering his summons. Instead, the door swung open almost immediately, and then it hit him. It was not a sound or a sight, but a physical force. A wave of warmth rolled out of the cabin, a dense, humid, living warmth that washed over him and enveloped him. It was a warmth so profound, so utterly at odds with the world outside, that for a moment his mind could not process it. His ice-caked beard and eyebrows began to melt instantly, the water trickling down his frozen cheeks. He stumbled inside, pulling the door shut against the wind, and stood there, blinking in the soft light. The scene before him was one of impossible domestic tranquility. Anders Nilsson stood before him, wearing a simple linen shirt, his sleeves rolled up to his forearms. On the floor, his 2 children, Lena and Eric, were playing with carved wooden animals. They were barefoot. His gaze drifted past them. Ilara Nilsson was at a small table, kneading dough, her face flushed with a gentle warmth. A kettle sat on the small cast-iron stove, letting out a gentle hiss. The stove itself was not glowing red. It was burning with a low, steady efficiency. He looked at the windows. There was no frost on the panes. He could see the swirling snow outside, a world away. He looked at the walls, at the corners where his own cabin was caked in ice. They were bare, clean wood. It was an island of impossible summer in the heart of an Arctic hell. Croft, the master builder, the respected expert, was speechless. His mind, trained in the realities of wood and cold and fire, struggled to reconcile what his senses were telling him. He felt like a man who had stepped through a doorway into another season. He was a visitor from a dying, frozen planet who had stumbled into a paradise. He moved as if in a dream. He walked to the north wall, the wall that bore the brunt of the punishing wind, and placed his bare hand flat against the logs. It was cool, yes, but it was not the life-leeching cold of his own walls. It was just wood. He looked up at the ceiling, the simple, unassuming pine planks. It looked utterly normal. There were no drips, there were no icicles, there was only the quiet, even warmth that filled the room from floor to ceiling. He finally found his voice, but it was a choked, disbelieving whisper. "How?" Anders gestured to the small stove. "The fire keeps us warm." "But your fire," Croft said, his voice gaining strength as his analytical mind began to reassert itself. "It is so small, a fire that size, it should not be able to do this. How much wood have you burned? How much wood have you used since the freeze began?" It was the crucial question, the one that would provide the data, the irrefutable proof. Anders turned and pointed to a neatly stacked pile of split logs against the wall. It was a modest pile, perhaps a quarter of a cord. "We are halfway through our second cord of the winter," he said, his tone simple, factual. The numbers landed like a physical blow. Silas Croft felt his breath catch in his chest. A second cord, halfway through. The freeze had lasted 5 days. Croft himself, in his own larger but masterfully built cabin, had burned through nearly a full cord in those 5 days alone. He was on his 4th cord for the winter and was already worrying about its remainder. He did the math in his head, his mind reeling. The Nielsens were living in a state of thermal luxury he could not have imagined, and they were doing it using less than half the fuel he was. The numbers were not just facts, they were an indictment. They were the complete and total demolition of everything he thought he knew. They were undeniable. He looked from the placid, warm children to the small, efficient stove, to the comfortable man in his shirt sleeves. He saw not foolishness, but a quiet, profound genius. He saw a man who had not fought the winter with brute force, but had outsmarted it with a principle as elegant as it was invisible. A deep wave of humility washed over Silas Croft, erasing the last remnants of his pride and skepticism. He looked at Anders Nielsen, not as a fool, but as a teacher. His voice was thick with an emotion he could not name, a mixture of awe, shame, and a desperate, urgent need to understand. "I was wrong," he said, the words clear and heavy in the warm air. "Completely wrong." He took a step closer to the Swedish shipwright. "You must show me. You must tell me how." When the great freeze finally broke, lifting like a fever, the stories began to circulate through the Blackwood Valley. They were tentative at first, whispers of Silas Croft's strange visit to the Nielsen cabin. But Croft, a man of unshakable integrity, did not allow whispers to do the work of truth. He told the story himself, openly and without reservation, at the trading post. He described the barefoot children, the warm walls, and the impossibly small woodpile. The mockery surrounding Nielsen's mirror box died overnight. The name remained, but its meaning was inverted. It was now spoken with a tone of respect and wonder. The joke had become a legend. The community, humbled and exhausted by their ordeal, looked at the quiet Swede with new eyes. He was no longer the foolish outsider. He was the man who held the secret to surviving the winter. The adoption of the idea was spearheaded by the most unlikely of champions, Silas Croft. His conversion was total. He spent a full day with Anders, crawling into the small attic space above the ceiling planks to see the hidden layer of tin for himself. Anders explained the principle of radiant heat, using simple analogies of light and mirrors. Croft, with his practical builder's mind, grasped it immediately. He saw not just the theory, but the elegant, achievable application. That spring, a new sound was heard across the valley. It was the tink, tink, tink of hammers on tin, as cabin after cabin was retrofitted with Nielsen ceiling. Croft became its most vocal advocate, lending his credibility and expertise to the process. He helped his neighbors pull down their old ceilings, install the radiant barrier, and rebuild. He developed slight improvements, suggesting a more consistent overlap for the tin sheets and better ways to seal the edges. The innovation was no longer one man's secret. It was becoming the community's shared wisdom. The following winter was different. The change was palpable. The huge, inefficient fires were no longer necessary. The consumption of firewood across the entire settlement dropped by nearly 40%. The cabins were not just warmer. They were a different kind of warm. It was an even ambient heat, free from the cold spots and icy drafts that had plagued them for years. Anders Nielsen never sought fame or payment for his idea. He was a quiet man, content to see his family safe and his neighbors secure. When men came to him with questions, he answered them patiently and simply, often demonstrating by sketching in the dirt with a stick. He became an informal teacher, a respected elder whose wisdom was sought on matters of building and warmth. His name was now attached to the method not through self-promotion, but through the genuine gratitude of the people he had helped. The real impact of Nielsen's ceiling was not measured in degrees on a thermometer or in cords of wood saved. It was measured in human lives, in the quiet currency of well-being. It was measured in the baby who survived its first winter without the constant, rasping cough that had taken so many others. It was measured in the elderly couple who could now move freely about their small home instead of being tethered to the hearth. It was measured in the simple, profound dignity of a family able to sit down to a meal in comfort without seeing their breath crystallize in the air before them. Anders Nielsen had not just built a better cabin, he had fundamentally improved the quality of life in a place defined by its harshness. The story of Nielsen's mirror box is a powerful lesson. It speaks to the conflict between entrenched tradition and disruptive innovation. It highlights the danger of dismissing an idea simply because it is unfamiliar, and the courage required to trust empirical evidence over popular opinion. Silas Croft's willingness to admit his error and embrace a better way is as much a part of the story as Anders's initial insight. This principle, which seemed so radical in a small Dakota cabin, was not lost to history. The concept of the radiant barrier is a cornerstone of modern building science and engineering. The same physics that bounced heat back down onto Anders Nielsen's family is used today in high-tech, foil-faced insulation that keeps our homes warm in the winter and cool in the summer. It is used in emergency space blankets to prevent hypothermia, and it is essential for protecting spacecraft from the extreme temperatures of space. The quiet shipwright's simple, powerful idea lives on. If this story of frontier ingenuity has changed the way you think about a simple cabin, hit that like button to help spread these forgotten histories. And subscribe for more tales of the practical wisdom our ancestors used to survive and thrive in the harshest of conditions. Let me know in the comments, what's the coldest winter you have ever had to endure? The historical events, characters, and names presented in this account have been fictionalized for narrative and educational purposes. The story is an illustrative reconstruction inspired by real engineering principles and the challenges faced by settlers in the 19th century. The technical concepts regarding thermal radiation and radiant barriers are based on established physics. This content does not constitute professional engineering or construction advice.